nobody talks about the sound. Everybody talks about the visual impression left by the sound. And it was these groups, these ayahuasca-taking groups, that when the German ethnographers got into the Amazon in the early part of the 20th century, they called this chemical telepathine. They recognized, that, and the reputation of ayahuasca is group states of mind. Well, if you're naive, then you think you're going to hear everybody thinking. No, you're going to see everyone thinking. You're going to see what people mean. And it's not that surprising when you think of it, because obviously the world arrives at the surface of our skin as a seamless body of electromagnetic and acoustical and pheromonal data. It's just that our eyes, our nostrils, our ears, our skin, we break up this incoming flow of data. And now we're close to McLuhan country here. I think what this hints at is that print skewed our perceptual apparatus, or our style of parsing perceptual data toward the acoustic space, so that for us thought became a voice, and very early in the Western tradition this is so. Jehovah is a voice in the Old Testament. The Logos is a voice in Hellenistic philosophy. We're the people of the voice. But apparently, there's a passage in Philo-Judaeus where he talks about the etymology of the word Israel. And he says Israel means he who sees God. He who sees God. And then he says, poses the question to himself, what is the more perfect logos? And then he says, the more perfect logos is that logos which goes from being heard to being seen without ever passing over a moment of noticeable transition. Well, I've actually seen this happen in psychedelic states, where you will be lying in silent darkness, you hear distant music, and as the music gets closer, it's like a band with lights and drums coming over a hill. As the music gets louder, it seems to physically approach, and a confusion of light turns into, pa, brass band, dancing elves, cavorting harlequins, and less easily described denizens of the imagination. And then it all goes thumping and marching past and disappears. But it's a perfect example of light and sound arriving together in the hallucinogenic space. The fact that we've talked here, or mentioned, that we have DMT in our pineal glands, in our brains, what we haven't said is we also have compounds in that same organ, very much like what's in ayahuasca. Occurring in the human pineal gland is a compound called adenosine. But when you give it its physical chemical nomenclature, it turns out it's 6-methoxy-tetrahydroharmalan. It's a very near relative of harmine and harmaline. So it doesn't strain me to believe that perhaps in looking at this phenomenon, we have actually put our finger on the place, the cutting edge of the evolution of consciousness right now at the biochemical level. What's happening is there's a shifting or an acceleration of the concentration of harmine-like alkaloids and DMT in the human pineal, and it's affecting our ability to process language, and it's pushing and exacerbating a bias toward visual understanding. And I see this then also reinforced and accelerated by the evolution of media. In the last 150 years, We go from photography to color photography to moving colored photography with sound, with stereophonic sound, and pointing toward virtual reality with more and more money to be made at each step of the way. And clearly, with the amounts of money now, we're outspending defense for entertainment. We will produce simulacrums of imaginary worlds. And, engineering bench tests will be to make it as much like Hawaii as possible, or as much like Tibet as possible. But what people will really want to do with these things is make worlds as strange as we can stand that are in these virtual places. So whether it comes through a natural evolution of the human nervous system or the evolution of an advanced interface with prostheses that create virtual realities, I think the transformation of how we do language is part of this acceleration into singularity. Yeah, Julian Jaynes, it didn't win him too many friends, but he wrote a big book and had this theory that this thing which we call the ego is so recent in human beings that it actually didn't exist at the time of Homer. And he goes into Homer and he shows that the God always breaks through in situations of crisis and danger. And he felt that before Homeric times, people were essentially like ants or something. That their behavior was largely instinctual, and that the only time they encountered this phenomenon of free will, the interrupting of the instinctual pattern, was in situations of great crisis and impending danger. And then this thing would literally almost come out of the sky and say, "Get your ass out of there, save yourself." Well, then over time, this ability to access this higher informational thing was like, again, the metaphor of encysted, closed over with the membrane of the self and made part of the machinery of the self, and that this is what the ego is. The ego is a Greek god that you have frozen like an ice cube behind your eyes, and that you think you are this thing, and that, this is just a cultural myth, a necessary weird idea, no more a true statement about the nature of the mind of the hominidae than anything else. One of the conclusions that novelty theory leads to in terms of its feedback into social, stuff, here and now stuff, is the idea that culture is not your friend. That culture is an impediment to understanding what's going on. That's why, to my mind, the word cult and the word culture have a direct relationship to each other. Culture is a cult, and if you feel revulsion at the thought of somebody, offering to the great carrot or tithing to some squirrely notion, just notice that your own culture is an extremely repressive cult that leads to all kinds of humiliation and degradation and automatic and unquestioned and unthinking behavior. There's a tendency to want to celebrate culture, springing both from the French deconstructionists and their fascination with culture, and then the effort to build pride through ethnicity thing. Well, that's all very fine, but I think the cultures we should all revere are our ancestral cultures. The cultures most of us have our roots in. The actual culture we came from was probably fairly squirrely.